Emily was only 13. She had $20 left in the world, an old backpack, and a promise she had made to her mother: never stop caring for animals that have no one else. So when an abandoned chicken farm went up for auction for exactly $20, she spent every last cent she had. People laughed. That farm is finished. The disease killed almost every bird. You're buying a graveyard. For a week, it looked like they were right. One by one, the chickens died. Emily buried each one with her own hands until there was only one frail little hen left, barely able to stand. Then something impossible happened. While cleaning the oldest coop, Emily noticed the tiny hen scratching at the same loose floorboard over and over again, as if it was trying to show her something hidden beneath the wood. What she uncovered there wouldn't just save the last chicken, it would expose a forgotten secret that had been buried for years and change the future of the entire farm forever. But to understand why that one little hen refused to die, we have to go back to the day Emily spent her last $20 on the farm everyone else had already given up on. Emily Carter had learned that grief didn't arrive all at once. It came in quiet moments, like reaching for a second bowl at breakfast before remembering there was no one left to fill it. 3 months had passed since the rainy afternoon when a truck skidded across the highway and took both of her parents away. Since then, the little white farmhouse where laughter once drifted through open windows had been sold to pay debts she barely understood. Most of their belongings disappeared into strangers' hands, leaving Emily with an old backpack, a faded family photograph, and $20 folded carefully inside her pocket. She now lived with her grandmother, Grace Carter, in a modest cottage at the edge of Millfield, where the mornings smelled of fresh bread instead of the chickens her parents had once raised in their backyard. Grace loved her granddaughter deeply, but she carried worry in every wrinkle around her eyes. Money was scarce, and every dollar mattered. Emily tried to help however she could. She swept floors, watered vegetables, and collected eggs from Grace's 3 aging hens. The birds always wandered toward her as if they sensed her gentle nature. "Animals remember kindness," her mother used to say. Emily repeated those words silently whenever the loneliness became too heavy. One Saturday morning, Grace handed her a small grocery list and the last $20 they could spare until the following week. "Only buy what's on the list," Grace said softly. "We'll make everything stretch." Emily nodded and tucked the bill safely into her pocket. On her way into town, she passed the community bulletin board outside the old feed store. A faded auction notice flapped in the breeze. "Abandoned chicken farm, final sale, starting bid $20. She stopped walking. Everyone in Millfield knew about Harper Farm. Years earlier, it had been one of the county's busiest poultry farms, until a terrible disease swept through the flock. Thousands of chickens died. The owners left, and no one ever managed to make the farm work again. Children whispered that the place was cursed. Adults simply called it a waste of land. Emily stared at the paper much longer than she should have. She imagined empty coops waiting in silence. She imagined frightened animals with no one left to care for them. Before she realized what she was doing, her feet carried her toward the small auction taking place that afternoon. Fewer than a dozen people gathered beside the rusted farm gate. Most had come only to watch. The auctioneer looked exhausted as he held up a clipboard. $20, he announced. "Any bids?" Nobody moved. A man laughed under his breath. "I'd rather burn $20. Another shook his hand. "The disease always comes back." Emily's heart pounded. She reached into her pocket and held up the folded bill with trembling fingers. "I'll buy it." Silence settled over the crowd. Then came scattered laughter. That little girl doesn't know what she's bought. Someone should call her grandmother. Poor kid just threw away her last dollar. The auctioneer hesitated before accepting the money. Well, congratulations. I suppose. He handed her a weathered envelope containing the deed and a rusty iron key. The laughter followed her all the way to the dusty road leading toward the farm. By late afternoon, Emily stood before a sagging wooden sign that still read Harper Farm, though several letters had fallen away. The entrance gate leaned crookedly on broken hinges. Tall weeds swallowed the fence posts. Wind rattled loose sheets of metal on the roofs of weathered chicken houses. She unlocked the gate and stepped inside. The silence felt strange. Farms were supposed to be full of sounds. Clucking hens, barking dogs, tractors, voices. Here there was only the creak of old wood and the distant call of crows. Emily forced herself forward. Most of the coops were empty. Broken feeders lay scattered across dirt floors. Cobwebs stretched between cracked beams. A sour smell lingered in the air, reminding her that sickness had once lived here. Then she heard it. A weak cluck. She hurried toward the largest coop. Inside, only a handful of chickens remained. Their feathers were dull. Several barely lifted their heads. Water buckets stood nearly empty, and spoiled feed covered the ground. "It's okay," Emily whispered, kneeling beside them. "I'm here now." She found an old bucket, cleaned it as best she could, and filled it with fresh water from a rusty hand pump that groaned with every stroke. Some birds ignored it. Others drank weakly before collapsing back into the straw. Emily spent the remaining daylight sweeping broken glass aside, opening windows to let fresh air in, and carrying away piles of rotten feed. Every task revealed another problem she had no idea how to solve. The roofs leaked, the fences leaned. The storage shed had almost no supplies left. As the sun dipped below the trees, she entered the smallest coop. Only one chicken remained inside. It was little more than skin and feathers, its breathing shallow, its body trembling with exhaustion. Emily slowly reached out her hand. The tiny hen lifted its head and looked directly into her eyes. For a brief second, it seemed to recognize the kindness standing before it. Then its legs gave way, and it collapsed into the straw. The little hen lay motionless for several seconds, before its chest rose in a slow, shaky breath. Emily gently lifted it into her arms, relieved to feel that it was still alive. "You're not giving up," she whispered. "Neither am I." She found an old wooden crate in the corner of the coop, lined it with clean straw from a dry bale she had discovered in the storage shed, and carefully placed the frail bird inside. The rest of the flock looked no better. Some sat with their feathers puffed out, refusing to eat. Others stumbled a few steps before collapsing again. Emily had never cared for sick animals on this scale. At home, her parents had always known what to do. They mixed special feed, cleaned wounds, and somehow seemed to understand what frightened animals needed. She only remembered small pieces of those lessons. She spent the night at the farmhouse wrapped in an old blanket she found in a closet. The building was dusty but sturdy enough to keep out the cold wind. Sleep came only in short moments between anxious trips to check the chickens. Every soft cluck made her sit upright. Every long silence filled her with dread. Before sunrise, she fetched fresh water again, scrubbed every bucket she could find, and swept away more spoiled feed. The work was exhausting, but she noticed something encouraging. The little hen drank a few drops of water from her hand. It was only a tiny improvement, yet it gave Emily enough hope to keep moving. Later that morning, Grace arrived in her aging pickup truck. Her expression mixed worry with disbelief as she stepped out and looked across the neglected farm. "Emily," she sighed gently, "I should have guessed where you'd be." Emily lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry I spent the grocery money." Grace looked at the broken buildings and the sick birds before answering. "I'm not angry because of the money." She placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "I'm afraid your heart is too kind for a place like this." Emily swallowed hard. "If I leave, they'll all die." Grace looked into the coop. Several chickens barely moved. She wanted to argue, but the determination in her granddaughter's face reminded her so much of Emily's mother that the words disappeared. Instead, she opened the truck bed. "I brought cleaning supplies, soap, and a few bags of feed. It's not much." Emily hugged her tightly. "Thank you." Together they worked through the afternoon. Grace repaired broken windows with old boards, while Emily cleaned feeders and replaced dirty bedding. Neither complained, though both understood the farm needed far more than 2 pairs of hands could provide. By evening, the first chicken died. Emily wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth before burying it beneath a large oak tree overlooking the fields. She stood silently for a moment, then returned to the coop. The next morning, another chicken died. By the third day, 3 more were gone. Each loss felt personal. Emily buried every bird herself, refusing to leave them lying in the coop. Grace watched from a distance, her heart breaking for the child who insisted on honoring every small life. News spread quickly through Millfield that the young girl who had bought Harper Farm was still trying to save the flock. Neighbors stopped occasionally along the roadside. Most never came through the gate. "It's no use," one elderly farmer called out. "That sickness never really left." Another shook his head. "My brother tried buying the place years ago. Lost every bird he owned." Emily thanked them for the warnings, but kept working. She disinfected water containers, burned moldy straw, and opened every door she could to let sunlight reach the dark coops. Nothing seemed to stop the deaths. By the end of the week, only a handful of chickens remained alive. One afternoon, a polished black truck rolled slowly into the farmyard. A well-dressed man stepped out, brushing dust from his expensive boots before looking around with obvious disappointment. "You must be Emily Carter," he said with a practiced smile. "I'm Walter Briggs." Emily nodded cautiously. She recognized the name. Walter owned one of the largest poultry businesses in the county. "I've heard about your purchase," he continued. "Brave decision." His eyes wandered across the damaged buildings. "Unfortunately, this place is beyond saving." Emily said nothing. Walter removed a business card from his pocket. "I'll make things easy. Sell me the property. I'll pay more than you spent and spare you months of heartache." Emily glanced toward the surviving chickens. "I'm not selling," Walter smiled politely, though it never reached his eyes. "Think carefully. You're young. This farm has already failed once. Then I'll try again." He tucked the card into her hand anyway. "If you change your mind, call me." As his truck disappeared down the road, Grace quietly joined Emily beside the coop. "Who was that?" "Someone who thinks the farm is hopeless." Grace looked toward the departing vehicle. "People with money rarely offer help, unless it helps them first." Emily folded the card and slipped it into her pocket without another word. 2 more chickens died over the next 2 days. Soon only one weak rooster and the tiny hen remained. The rooster refused food and barely opened its eyes. The little hen, however, continued drinking small amounts of water and pecking cautiously at fresh grain. It was still painfully thin, but somehow it endured. On the 8th morning, an old blue station wagon pulled into the yard. A silver-haired woman climbed out carrying a worn leather medical bag. "I'm Dr. Helen Morris," she introduced herself warmly. "I heard someone very young was trying very hard to save an impossible farm." Emily smiled shyly. Helen spent nearly an hour quietly examining the remaining birds. She checked their feathers, eyes, breathing, and feet with calm, practiced movements. Finally, she crouched beside the little hen, gently lifting one wing before studying it closely. A thoughtful expression crossed her face. She looked back at Emily with unmistakable surprise. "How long has this one been alive?" "Since the day I arrived," Emily answered. Helen carefully set the bird back into the straw. The tiny hen stood unsteadily, then pecked once at the fresh feed before looking up again. Helen remained silent for several moments. Then she spoke so softly that only Emily could hear. "This chicken shouldn't still be alive." Dr. Helen Morris remained crouched beside the little hen, watching it with the quiet patience that came from decades of caring for animals. The bird was still painfully thin, but its eyes were bright. Its breathing, though slow, was steady. After another careful examination, Helen closed her medical bag and stood. "I can't promise anything," she said, "but if this hen has survived while the others haven't, we need to protect her." Emily nodded immediately. "What should I do?" "Keep her away from every other bird. Fresh water, clean bedding, good food, no unnecessary stress." Helen looked around the neglected coop. "If she truly is different, we can't risk losing her." Emily carefully carried the little hen into the farmhouse. She found an old laundry basket, lined it with soft straw, and placed it beside the kitchen window where warm sunlight reached the floor each morning. The hen blinked uncertainly before settling down. Emily smiled for the first time in days. "You'll stay here until you're stronger." Grace watched from the doorway. "I've never seen someone turn a farmhouse kitchen into a chicken nursery." Emily laughed softly. "She needs somewhere safe." Grace simply nodded. There was no point arguing anymore. The farm had become part of Emily's heart. Later that afternoon, Helen returned carrying several small bottles and a notebook. She explained each step carefully, showing Emily how to check the hen's breathing, examine its eyes, and record how much it ate each day. "These aren't complicated tests," Helen said. "Mostly observation. Sometimes the smallest details tell us the most." Emily wrote everything down exactly as instructed. Morning feeding, water intake, activity, droppings, weight. Every evening, Helen stopped by briefly to review the notes. By the third day, they noticed something encouraging. The hen was eating slightly more grain. Its feathers looked cleaner after Emily gently wiped them with warm water. More importantly, its strength was improving little by little. "She's fighting," Helen said quietly. "I've seen birds survive terrible illnesses before. But this..." She paused before finishing her thought. "This is unusual." Emily looked at the tiny bird scratching weakly inside the basket. "Maybe she just wants to live." Helen smiled gently. "Sometimes that's reason enough." While Emily cared for the hen inside the farmhouse, the empty coops outside demanded attention. Broken doors hung crookedly from rusted hinges. Several roof panels had shifted during old storms, allowing rain to soak the straw beneath them. Emily knew healthy birds could never return unless the buildings became safe again. She climbed onto a small ladder one morning, trying to nail a loose board back into place. The hammer slipped from her hand and landed in the dirt below. "Need some help?" a voice called. Emily looked down to see a teenage boy standing beside an old pickup truck parked near the gate. He carried a toolbox over one shoulder. "I'm Noah Brooks," he introduced himself. "My family's farm is about 2 miles east." Emily climbed down carefully. "What brings you here?" Noah shrugged. "My dad heard someone actually bought Harper Farm. He figured you'd need spare nails more than we do." He opened the toolbox. "I also fix things." Emily smiled gratefully. "I definitely need that." They spent the afternoon replacing loose boards, repairing broken latches, and reinforcing sections of fence that threatened to collapse. Noah worked quickly, explaining simple tricks for strengthening old wood instead of replacing it completely. "New lumber costs money," he said. "Good repairs just take patience." Emily listened carefully, eager to learn. As they worked, conversation came naturally. Noah admitted he had believed the rumors about the farm until he saw Emily cleaning every coop herself. "Most people would have walked away after the first week," he said. Emily tightened a loose screw on a feeder. "The chickens couldn't walk away." Noah glanced toward the farmhouse window where the little hen rested inside its basket. "Guess that little one got lucky." Emily shook her head. "I think I did." By sunset, they had repaired the largest coop well enough to keep out rain. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Before leaving, Noah pointed toward the oldest chicken house at the far end of the property. "That building looks older than the others." Emily followed his gaze. The weathered structure leaned slightly, its faded red paint nearly gone. "It probably needs the most work. We'll save it for last," Noah said. "Old buildings always have surprises." The next morning, Emily began cleaning inside the oldest coop. Thick layers of dust covered every surface. Most of the shelves had collapsed, and several nesting boxes had rotted away completely. As she swept near one corner, the broom struck something solid beneath the floorboards. The sound was different, hollow instead of dull. Curious. She knelt and brushed away years of dirt. One wooden plank seemed slightly raised above the others. She carefully pried it loose using the claw of her hammer. Beneath it lay a narrow compartment, just deep enough to hide a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Emily carried it outside into the sunlight before carefully untying the brittle fabric. Inside were several worn notebooks covered with dust, but remarkably dry. Their leather covers had cracked with age. The first page of the top notebook read simply, "Feeding Records, Harper Farm." Emily turned another page. Every entry listed dates, weather, feed mixtures, and notes about individual groups of chickens. Some pages contained careful observations written in neat handwriting. Others included sketches of birds marked with small symbols she didn't understand. Noah arrived a few minutes later carrying replacement hinges. "Find something?" Emily handed him one of the notebooks. He flipped through several pages. "These look old." Helen happened to stop by shortly afterward and joined them beneath the shade of the oak tree. She adjusted her glasses while reading a few entries. "Interesting," she murmured. "These aren't ordinary farm records." Emily leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Helen pointed toward several repeated notes beside certain chickens. Whoever kept these wasn't simply tracking feed. They were comparing different family lines. Noah frowned. "Like breeding." Helen nodded slowly. "Very careful breeding." They continued reading together for nearly an hour. The notebooks described individual hens, their health, egg production, and how certain birds responded differently during seasonal illnesses. Every observation had been recorded with remarkable detail. Emily felt as though she were listening to someone speaking across many years, patiently explaining the farm, one page at a time. "Someone spent a long time doing this," she whispered. Helen agreed. "Years, judging by these dates." Emily carefully opened the final notebook in the stack. Several pages near the middle had yellowed with age. Then she stopped turning. One section had been cleanly removed. The paper had not torn naturally. Someone had deliberately cut the pages away with a sharp blade, leaving only narrow stubs attached to the binding. Emily slowly looked up. These pages didn't fall out. Helen gently touched the damaged edge. No, she said quietly. Someone made sure they were gone. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the missing pages. Every evening, after feeding the little hen and recording its progress in Helen's notebook, she returned to the old journals. She read every remaining line carefully, hoping the missing information had been mentioned somewhere else. Most entries focused on feeding schedules, weather, egg production, and careful observations about different family lines of chickens. Whoever had written them had loved precision. Nothing was rushed. Every bird mattered. Yet the missing section left an empty space that seemed far larger than the few pages that had been cut away. People usually remove things because they don't want them found, Noah said one afternoon as they sat beneath the oak tree reviewing another notebook. Emily traced her finger across the damaged binding. Or because they were important. Helen nodded thoughtfully. Either way, someone made a choice. She closed the journal gently. Before we guess any further, we should speak with the person who knew this farm better than anyone. Emily looked up. You mean Evelyn Harper? Helen smiled faintly. If she'll talk. The following morning, Grace drove Emily to the Maple Grove retirement home on the edge of town. The building overlooked a quiet pond surrounded by flowering shrubs. Everything felt peaceful, but Emily's stomach tightened as they walked inside. She wasn't sure what she would say to the woman who had once owned the farm she now called home. A nurse led them to a sunny sitting room where an elderly woman sat beside the window, knitting a pale blue blanket. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her hands moved slowly but steadily. Mrs. Harper, the nurse said gently, you have visitors. Evelyn Harper looked up with kind but tired eyes. When Helen introduced Emily, the older woman's expression changed almost instantly. Harper Farm, she repeated softly. Emily nodded. I bought it. Evelyn carefully placed the knitting into her lap. For several long seconds, she simply stared out the window again. You shouldn't have done that. Emily hesitated before answering. Everyone keeps telling me that, because they're right. Her voice carried sadness rather than anger. That farm has taken enough from people. Emily reached into her backpack and carefully removed one of the journals. I found these beneath the floorboards. Evelyn's hands froze. She recognized the worn leather cover immediately. For a brief moment, emotion flickered across her face, but it disappeared just as quickly. Where exactly? Inside the oldest coop. Evelyn closed her eyes. Some things are better left where they were. Emily leaned forward. The pages were cut out. Do you know why? The elderly woman opened her eyes again but said nothing. Helen waited patiently beside Emily, allowing the silence to settle instead of filling it with questions. Finally, Evelyn spoke. Those journals belong to the past, but they might help save the farm, Emily said quietly. Evelyn slowly shook her head. No, child. The farm doesn't need old memories. She stood carefully with the aid of a walking stick. It needs someone wise enough to walk away. Without another word, she thanked the nurse and slowly left the room. Emily watched her disappear down the hallway, disappointment weighing heavily on her heart. Grace placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Sometimes painful memories stay locked away for a reason. Emily nodded, but she couldn't believe Evelyn had reacted that strongly to a simple notebook. During the drive home, Helen remained unusually quiet. Only when they reached the farm did she finally speak. She recognized those journals immediately. Emily agreed. She knows something. Helen looked toward the old chicken houses standing beneath the afternoon sun. She also looked frightened. Life at the farm remained difficult. The little hen continued growing stronger, scratching around the farmhouse kitchen whenever Emily allowed it outside its basket. The lonely rooster, however, became weaker each day, despite Helen's care. Emily cleaned the coops daily, repaired broken fencing with Noah's help, and stretched every bag of feed as far as possible. Even small victories required constant effort. One afternoon, a county truck stopped outside the front gate. Two inspectors climbed out carrying clipboards. Walter Briggs stood nearby with folded arms, watching from his own vehicle parked along the road. Emily's heart sank. One inspector introduced himself politely before explaining that complaints had been filed regarding unsafe structures and possible health concerns at Harper Farm. "We are required to inspect the property," he said. Emily cooperated without argument. Walking with them through each building, she answered every question honestly. Yes, most of the coops had been damaged before she arrived. Yes, many chickens had died. Yes, repairs were still underway. The inspectors examined roofs, fences, storage sheds, and water supplies. They took notes but remained professional throughout. Finally, one of them stopped beside the oldest coop. "This building needs immediate attention," he said. "The roof supports are weak." Emily looked upward. He was right. Noah had reinforced several walls, but they hadn't yet reached that section. "I'll repair it," she promised. The inspector nodded. "We'll give you a reasonable amount of time. If the structure becomes dangerous, we'll have no choice but to close access to it." Walter stepped forward after the inspectors returned to their truck. "You see," he said calmly, "this place is falling apart." Emily faced him without lowering her eyes. "It's still standing." Walter sighed as though speaking to a stubborn child. "Sometimes holding on only makes things worse." "Not always." His polite smile returned. "My offer still stands if you change your mind." Emily said nothing. Walter tipped his hat slightly before driving away. That evening, Noah arrived carrying fresh lumber his father had donated. "Heard about the inspectors," he said. "Figured we'd better start fixing that roof tomorrow." Emily smiled gratefully. "Thank you." They worked until sunset, reinforcing beams inside the oldest coop. The labor was slow because every repair uncovered another weakness hidden beneath years of neglect. While Noah secured a support post, Emily swept away loose debris from one corner where the floor remained uneven. She paused, remembering Helen's words and the missing journal pages. "Do you think there could be another hiding place?" she asked. Noah looked around thoughtfully. "Old farms usually have plenty." They searched carefully for nearly an hour, but found nothing unusual. Dust coated their clothes, and the fading light made every shadow appear deeper than it really was. Just as they prepared to leave, Grace called from outside that dinner was ready. Emily took one last look around the weathered building before following Noah toward the door. The next afternoon, Helen stopped by after visiting Maple Grove again. Emily immediately noticed something different in her expression. "Did you see Mrs. Harper?" Helen nodded. "Briefly. Did she say anything?" Helen hesitated. "At first, no." She looked toward the oldest coop standing quietly beyond the yard. "But as I was leaving, she asked me to tell you something." Emily waited anxiously. Helen repeated the words exactly as they had been spoken. She said, "The answer isn't in the barn. It's beneath it." The words stayed with Emily all night. The answer isn't in the barn. It's beneath it. She repeated them while feeding the little hen before sunrise. The bird had grown stronger over the past week. It no longer remained curled inside the laundry basket all day. Instead, it wandered across the farmhouse kitchen, pecking curiously at scattered grains before returning to Emily whenever she spoke. Watching the tiny survivor regain its strength reminded Emily why she refused to abandon the farm. After breakfast, Noah arrived carrying a pry bar, a flashlight, and a coil of rope. "Ready to see what's under that old coop?" he asked. Emily smiled. "I've been ready since yesterday." Grace insisted they work carefully. "If there's a hidden space, those beams have been holding up that building for decades. Don't force anything." Helen agreed. "Safety first. Curiosity won't help if the roof comes down." Together they walked to the oldest chicken house. Morning light slipped through gaps in the weathered walls, illuminating floating dust. The repaired support posts Noah had installed made the structure feel sturdier, but every step still produced soft creaks beneath their boots. Emily studied the uneven floorboards again. She remembered where the journals had been hidden. If Evelyn's message was accurate, there had to be something more. Noah tapped different sections of the floor with the pry bar. Most answered with a solid thud. Near the center of the coop, however, one section echoed faintly. He crouched and knocked again. "Hear that?" Emily nodded. "It's hollow." They brushed away years of dirt until the outlines of a square wooden panel became visible. Rusted nails had been driven carefully around its edges, nearly invisible beneath layers of dust. "Someone wanted this hidden," Noah said quietly. Working slowly, they removed each nail without damaging the surrounding boards. The panel resisted at first, then lifted with a long groan as trapped air escaped from below. A cool, earthy smell drifted upward. Beneath the opening was a narrow wooden ladder disappearing into darkness. Emily aimed the flashlight downward. The beam revealed a small underground room built from rough stone and old timber. The walls looked dry despite their age. "I'll go first," Noah said. Emily shook her head. "We go together." One careful step at a time, they climbed into the hidden space while Grace and Helen waited above. The room was no larger than a garden shed, but everything inside had been arranged with remarkable care. Wooden shelves lined one wall, dust covered nearly every surface, yet nothing appeared disturbed. Emily slowly turned the flashlight toward a long table standing in the center. Stacks of leather folders rested beside neatly tied bundles of papers. Along another shelf stood several small wooden boxes containing carefully labeled eggshell halves preserved inside cotton lining. Noah picked one up gently. Tiny handwritten labels listed dates beside each shell. "These were saved on purpose," he murmured. Emily opened one of the leather folders. Inside were detailed breeding records unlike anything she had seen before. Every page traced family lines through generations of chickens. Carefully drawn diagrams connected hens and roosters with notes about health, temperament, egg quality, and resistance to seasonal illnesses. "This matches the journals," Emily whispered. Helen climbed carefully into the room after them. She adjusted her glasses and began reading the records in silence. Her expression grew more thoughtful with every page. "These weren't ordinary farm notes," she said. "Evelyn documented entire heritage bloodlines." Emily turned another page filled with meticulous observations. Each generation had been tracked over many years. Some birds were marked with stars beside comments describing unusual strength during previous outbreaks of disease. Helen pointed to several entries. "She wasn't breeding for higher production. Then what was she breeding for?" Emily asked. Helen answered without looking up. "Health." Along the back wall, Noah discovered a narrow cabinet hidden behind old feed sacks. Inside lay dozens of sealed envelopes tied together with faded string. The first letter was addressed simply to whoever cares enough to continue. Emily carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The handwriting matched the journals. The letter explained that preserving healthy bloodlines required patience that many people no longer valued. Every generation had been selected slowly, never rushed. She knew these records mattered, Emily said softly. Helen nodded. Very much. Emily continued reading. Several later letters described growing pressure to abandon the careful breeding program. Buyers wanted faster-growing birds, larger flocks, and quicker profits. Evelyn repeatedly refused. One sentence appeared again and again in different letters. Healthy birds cannot be rushed. Noah opened another bundle. These letters were different. Their tone was tense. They described meetings, disagreements, and repeated attempts to convince Evelyn to change her methods. Although names were rarely mentioned in full, one company appeared several times on official letterheads attached to the correspondence. Emily stared at the familiar name printed across the top of one page. Briggs Agricultural Enterprises. Noah looked at her quietly. Walter. Helen accepted the document and examined it carefully. Similar letterheads appeared on several more papers stored beneath the first bundle. Some requested meetings. Others offered contracts. Later letters became increasingly firm, encouraging Evelyn to modernize production and abandon what they described as outdated breeding practices. Emily felt her stomach tighten. He said the farm was hopeless. Helen carefully organized the papers back into neat stacks. These letters don't explain everything. No, Emily agreed. But they explain why someone wanted these records hidden. She looked around the underground room once more. Every shelf, every folder, every carefully preserved eggshell represented years of quiet work that someone had refused to let disappear. Above them, sunlight filtered faintly through the narrow opening in the floor. Emily held one of the letters gently in both hands before looking at Helen. Walter's company kept showing up long before I bought this farm. Helen met her eyes but said nothing. Neither of them needed to. The evidence lying on the table spoke for itself. Helen spent the next 2 evenings studying the breeding records in the farmhouse kitchen, while Emily carefully followed every instruction written inside the journals. The little hen remained the center of their attention. It now wandered confidently around the room, scratching at loose grains and occasionally hopping onto the lowest windowsill to watch the yard outside. Its feathers had become smoother, and the dull look in its eyes had disappeared. Helen compared the notes in Evelyn Harper's records with her own observations before finally closing the last folder. I'm convinced now, she said quietly. Emily looked up from cleaning a feeding bowl. About what? Helen rested one hand on the stack of journals. This hen belongs to the heritage bloodline Evelyn spent years protecting. Emily smiled at the bird. So she really is different. Not because she's special by accident, Helen replied, because generations of careful breeding made her stronger. Emily remembered the words repeated throughout the hidden letters. Healthy birds cannot be rushed. For the first time, those words truly made sense. Grace listened from the stove while preparing supper. Can the farm recover with only one hen? Helen nodded slowly. If she's healthy and fertile, yes. It will take patience, but every flock begins somewhere. Emily looked toward the tiny survivor. Then we'll begin with her. The following morning, Helen helped Emily prepare a small nesting area inside the warmest corner of the farmhouse. Using Evelyn's notes as a guide, they adjusted the feed mixture, adding grains and crushed oyster shells exactly as recommended. Nothing expensive, Nothing complicated, just careful attention to details that most people overlooked. Noah arrived carrying fresh lumber and smiled when he saw the little hen confidently following Emily across the kitchen floor. "She's running the place now," Emily laughed. "I think she believes she owns it." Together they repaired an old brooding box that had been stored in the shed for years. Noah replaced broken boards while Emily scrubbed every surface until it looked almost new. Helen inspected their work with approval. "If we're lucky," she said, "we'll soon have somewhere safe for chicks." Luck, however, proved slower than hope. The little hen eventually laid several eggs, and Emily guarded each one as though it were made of glass. She carefully followed every instruction from Evelyn's journals, checking temperature, turning the eggs gently, and keeping detailed notes. Every morning began with excitement. Every evening ended with quiet waiting. Days passed. Then the first egg failed. Emily held the silent shell in her hands long after Helen confirmed nothing had developed inside. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked softly. Helen shook her head. "No. Nature doesn't promise success every time." Emily nodded, though disappointment settled heavily inside her. The second egg also failed. Noah found her sitting quietly outside the coop, staring across the empty pasture. "Bad day?" he asked. She showed him the empty shell. "I thought maybe—" Her voice faded. Noah sat beside her without speaking for a while. Finally, he pointed toward the little hen scratching happily through fresh straw. "She's still here." Emily smiled faintly. "She is. Then you still have hope." Those simple words helped more than Noah realized. Emily stood, brushed the dirt from her jeans, and returned to the farmhouse. If Evelyn had spent years building healthy bloodlines, Emily could certainly survive a few disappointments. As the weeks passed, another problem became impossible to ignore. Feed supplies grew smaller every day. Grace quietly counted the remaining bags in the shed before sitting beside Emily one evening at the kitchen table. "We'll have enough for another week," she admitted gently. Emily looked down at her notebook. She had already delayed replacing broken fencing and postponed repairs to save every dollar possible. There was almost nothing left to cut. "I'll figure something out," she whispered. Grace reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to carry all of this alone." The next morning, Emily discovered 2 small sacks of grain sitting outside the front gate. No note, no name. She looked up and down the empty road but saw no one. By afternoon, an elderly neighbor stopped by carrying a bundle of clean straw. "Had extra," he said with an awkward smile, before quickly returning to his truck. The following day, someone left a box of nesting material beside the porch. Then Noah's father delivered several repaired water buckets. Word had quietly spread through Millfield that the young girl hadn't abandoned the farm despite everything. One by one, neighbors who had once doubted her began offering small acts of kindness. None of the gifts were large, but together they kept the farm moving forward. Grace looked around the growing collection of supplies and smiled. "Looks like people have started believing in you." Emily shook her head. "Maybe they're believing in the farm." Helen smiled warmly. "Sometimes that's the same thing." A few days later, the little hen laid another egg. Emily approached it with cautious optimism instead of excitement. She followed the routine exactly as before, refusing to rush any step. Every evening she checked the brooding box. Every morning she waited a little longer before lifting the lid. Noah visited often, though neither of them spoke much about the egg. They simply continued repairing fences, replacing roof boards, and cleaning coops, while time passed naturally. Nearly 3 weeks later, Emily heard the faintest sound as she entered the farmhouse before sunrise. She froze. At first, she thought she had imagined it. Then she heard it again, a tiny peeping noise coming from inside the brooding box. Her hands trembled as she slowly lifted the lid. A small crack had appeared in the shell. Another tiny peep followed. Emily called for Grace, then Helen, then Noah, her voice echoing across the quiet farm. They gathered around the box in complete silence. The crack widened little by little until a damp yellow beak pushed through the shell. Minutes later, a tiny chick struggled free, exhausted but alive. Emily gently wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. The little hen watched quietly from nearby, giving a soft cluck as the newborn chick lifted its head for the very first time. The tiny chick quickly became the brightest sign of hope Harper Farm had seen in years. Every morning, Emily hurried to the brooding box before doing anything else. The little yellow bird grew stronger each day, always staying close to the lone hen that had somehow survived when every other chicken had fallen ill. Watching them together reminded Emily that even the smallest beginning could matter. Helen continued comparing the chick's development with Evelyn Harper's breeding records. Every measurement matched the careful notes written decades earlier. One afternoon, she closed another journal and looked at Emily with quiet satisfaction. "I'm ready to explain what I believe happened here. Emily, Grace, and Noah gathered around the kitchen table while Helen spread several pages across its worn surface. She pointed first to the oldest feeding records, then to the detailed breeding charts they had recovered from beneath the coop. "Most commercial farms wanted chickens that grew faster and produced more eggs," Helen began. "That sounds good at first, but speed became more important than long-term health." Noah nodded slowly. "So they stopped caring about strong bloodlines." "Exactly." Helen tapped Evelyn's handwritten notes. "Evelyn did the opposite. She selected birds that stayed healthy through difficult seasons instead of simply choosing the biggest ones. It took years, but she slowly built a heritage line that resisted illnesses naturally." Emily looked toward the little hen resting beside her chick. "So she isn't immune because of luck?" "No," Helen replied. "She's the result of generations of patient breeding." Grace smiled softly. "Your mother used to say shortcuts always cost more in the end." Helen continued, "When farms focused only on rapid production, birds became more vulnerable. Disease spread faster because the flocks lacked the natural strength Evelyn spent years preserving." Emily lowered her eyes to the journals. The repeated sentence echoed once more in her mind. Healthy birds cannot be rushed. It no longer sounded like simple farming advice. It sounded like a way of living. News about the healthy chick quietly spread beyond Millfield. Several neighboring farmers stopped by to ask questions. Some came out of genuine curiosity. Others wanted to see whether the stories were true. Emily welcomed each visitor with the same honesty she had shown from the beginning. She explained how she had found the journals, how Helen had helped interpret them, and how the little hen had survived. She never exaggerated what she knew. Instead, she showed them Evelyn's careful records and described the importance of breeding for health instead of speed. One older farmer studied the journals for nearly an hour before closing them carefully. "My grandfather used to keep records like these," he admitted. "We stopped years ago." Another visitor remained unconvinced. "One healthy chick doesn't prove anything," he said. Emily nodded respectfully. "You're right. It doesn't." She looked toward the brooding box where the chick slept beneath its mother's wing. "But it's enough for me to keep trying." The farmer tipped his hat politely before leaving. Not everyone needed convincing. Emily understood that. A few days later, Noah helped build a larger protected enclosure beside the farmhouse, so the little family could spend time outdoors safely. The chick eagerly chased insects through fresh grass while the little hen watched closely. Grace laughed as Emily knelt nearby, smiling wider than she had in months. "I've missed seeing that face," Grace said quietly. Emily looked up. "Which face?" "The one your parents always brought out whenever there were baby animals around." Emily's smile softened, but this time the memory brought comfort instead of pain. She realized that caring for the farm no longer reminded her only of what she had lost. It also reminded her of everything her parents had taught her. Late one afternoon, Helen drove into town carrying copies of several breeding records. She planned to leave them with the county agricultural office for preservation. "Knowledge like this shouldn't disappear again," she explained. Emily agreed immediately. The original journals remained safely locked inside the farmhouse, but sharing copies felt right. If Evelyn's work could help other farmers raise healthier flocks, then hiding it served no purpose. Several days passed peacefully. Repairs continued. The chick grew stronger. More neighbors occasionally dropped off small bags of grain or offered spare lumber. Hope slowly replaced the silence that had once surrounded Harper Farm. Then, just before sunset one evening, a white envelope arrived in the mailbox at the end of the lane. Emily carried it back to the porch and opened it carefully. Inside was a neatly typed legal notice. She frowned as she read the first lines. Grace stepped beside her. "What is it?" Emily handed her the paper without speaking. Grace's expression tightened immediately. Noah arrived a few minutes later and read the notice over her shoulder. The letter stated that Briggs Agricultural Enterprises formally objected to the distribution of certain farm records and warned that further sharing of documents connected to Harper Farm could result in legal action. Emily looked toward the quiet fields where the little hen scratched peacefully beside her growing chick. She folded the notice carefully and held it in both hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Noah broke the silence. "Walter's trying to stop you." Emily read the legal notice 3 more times before placing it carefully inside one of Evelyn Harper's journals. She refused to let anger replace the hope the little farm had slowly begun to rebuild. Walter Briggs had not ordered her to leave the property. He had not taken the journals. The letter was meant to frighten her, and she knew it. Even so, the words lingered in her mind long after the sun disappeared behind the fields. The following morning, Helen examined the notice over a cup of coffee in the farmhouse kitchen. She read every line before folding it neatly. "This isn't a court order," she said calmly. "It's a warning." Emily looked relieved but still uncertain. "Can he stop us from sharing Evelyn's work?" Helen shook her head. "These journals belong to the farm now. Walter's lawyers are trying to make people afraid before anyone asks difficult questions." Grace placed fresh bread on the table. "Fear is cheaper than truth." Emily smiled faintly. Her grandmother rarely spoke in sayings, but when she did, they stayed with you. Outside, the little hen scratched through fresh straw, while her growing chick chased tiny insects around the protected enclosure Noah had built. Watching them always settled Emily's thoughts. The birds never worried about tomorrow. They simply did the work of living. She decided she would do the same. Repairs became the family's first priority again. The county inspectors had allowed time to strengthen the oldest chicken house, and Emily intended to finish before they returned. Noah arrived early every morning carrying tools borrowed from his father's workshop. Together, they replaced cracked roof supports, reinforced loose beams, and patched holes where rain had leaked inside for years. The work was slow because much of the old lumber could not simply be replaced. Each repair required careful measuring to avoid damaging the original structure hidden beneath decades of neglect. Emily learned quickly. Noah showed her how to brace weak joints before removing damaged boards, and how to test old wood without splitting it. By the end of the week, she could swing a hammer with confidence instead of hesitation. "You're getting good at this," Noah said while tightening a bolt above one of the coupe doors. Emily laughed. "A few months ago, I barely knew how to hold a hammer. Now you're teaching me patience." Grace watched them from the porch with quiet pride. The farm still had far to go, but it no longer looked abandoned. Fresh boards stood beside weathered ones. Broken fences had become straight again. Windows once covered with dirt now reflected the morning light. Word spread through Millfield that Harper Farm was fighting to survive instead of waiting to disappear. One Saturday morning, Noah surprised Emily by arriving with 6 volunteers from neighboring farms. Some carried ladders, others brought paintbrushes, fencing wire, or boxes of old tools. The elderly farmer who had once warned Emily that the disease always returned climbed out of his truck carrying heavy roof shingles. "Figured these were better up here than sitting in my shed," he said with an embarrassed smile. Emily thanked every person individually. By lunchtime, laughter echoed across the farmyard for the first time in years. Volunteers repaired gates, cleared weeds, cleaned drainage ditches, and strengthened fences while Grace prepared sandwiches for everyone working beneath the warm autumn sun. Helen smiled as she watched the community come together. "Hope spreads faster than fear," she said quietly. Emily realized she was no longer carrying the farm alone. Late that afternoon, the county inspectors returned. Emily greeted them nervously, wondering whether all their hard work would be enough. The inspectors carefully examined the repaired roof supports, the strengthened walls, and the cleaned coops. They checked water supplies and walked slowly through every building. Finally, the older inspector closed his clipboard. "You've made remarkable progress," he admitted. "Continue maintaining the structures, and we'll consider the previous concerns resolved." Emily thanked him with obvious relief as the county truck disappeared down the road. Noah raised one dusty fist into the air. "Told you we'd finish in time." Emily laughed. "We did." That evening, Grace quietly asked Emily to join her inside the farmhouse after supper. She placed a small envelope on the kitchen table. "There's something I need to tell you." Emily opened it carefully. Inside was a bank receipt. Her eyes widened as she read the amount. "Grandma, what is this?" Grace took a slow breath. "I mortgaged my savings." Emily looked up in shock. "You did what?" "The money paid for lumber, feed, roofing supplies, and the repairs we couldn't postpone." Emily's voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace reached across the table and gently held her granddaughter's hands. "Because I knew you would have tried to stop me." Tears filled Emily's eyes. "Those savings were for you." Grace smiled warmly. "No, sweetheart. They were for our family. Right now."
This farm is our family.
Emily stood and wrapped her arms around her grandmother without saying another word. They remained there for several moments while the evening breeze drifted through the open kitchen window. The following afternoon, Helen drove Emily back to Maple Grove Retirement Home. This time, Evelyn Harper welcomed them without hesitation. She had heard from Helen that the hidden records had been preserved safely and that the first healthy chick had hatched. Emily showed her a recent photograph of the little hen standing proudly beside her growing chick. Evelyn smiled through tears. "She looks exactly like her grandmother," she whispered. Emily listened quietly as Evelyn spoke more openly than ever before. Years earlier, she had refused every demand to replace her careful breeding program with faster commercial methods. She believed healthy animals deserved time and patience, even when others called her stubborn. As neighboring farms changed, pressure on Harper Farm increased. Money became tight. Eventually, she had been forced to leave the property she loved. But before walking away, she hid the breeding records beneath the coop, hoping someone kind enough would someday continue the work instead of destroying it. "I never stopped wondering if anyone would find them," Evelyn admitted. Emily gently squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you kept believing." Evelyn smiled. "I'm glad you did too." Back at Harper Farm, life continued quietly. The first chick had nearly doubled in size. More eggs rested safely inside the brooding box, and Emily cared for each one with patient optimism instead of desperate hope. Early one cool morning, she carried fresh water to the outdoor enclosure and stopped in surprise. The little hen stood calmly in the grass, while several young chickens wandered nearby, pecking happily beneath the autumn sunlight. Emily counted them once, then again, just to be certain. Everyone looked healthy. Everyone moved with confident energy. She smiled as the flock explored the yard together, realizing the empty farm no longer felt empty at all. The young chickens filled the farmyard with sounds Emily had almost forgotten. Every morning began with cheerful peeping, soft clucking, and tiny feet scratching through fresh straw. She still rose before sunrise, carrying buckets of clean water and carefully measuring feed according to Evelyn Harper's journals. But the work no longer felt like a struggle to keep something alive. It felt like watching life return, one careful day at a time. Helen continued visiting several times each week, recording the birds' progress beside Evelyn's original notes. She compared weight, feather growth, appetite, and behavior with the decades-old breeding records. Every observation strengthened her confidence. "They're developing exactly as Evelyn hoped they would," she said one afternoon while closing another notebook. Emily smiled as one curious chick hopped onto her boot before quickly running back toward its mother. "It's hard to believe they all came from one little hen." Helen looked toward the survivor, who calmly watched over the growing flock. Every strong family begins somewhere. The hidden journals no longer remained a secret shared by only a few people. With Helen's help, Emily prepared organized copies of Evelyn's breeding records for neighboring farmers who genuinely wanted to learn. She never claimed to be an expert. Instead, she simply explained what Evelyn had discovered through years of patience. Several farmers visited Harper Farm carrying notebooks of their own. They asked questions about feeding schedules, breeding choices, and the detailed observations Evelyn had recorded over generations. Emily answered honestly whenever she knew the answer and admitted when she did not. "I'm still learning too," she often said. The older farmers appreciated her honesty. One afternoon, the elderly man who had once warned Emily to abandon the farm returned carrying a weathered ledger. He placed it gently on the kitchen table. "My father kept breeding records years ago," he admitted. "I stopped writing after he passed away." Emily opened the faded book carefully. The pages contained handwritten notes similar to Evelyn's journals, though much shorter. The old farmer smiled with quiet embarrassment. "Seeing your farm reminded me that some things shouldn't disappear." Emily handed the ledger back respectfully. "Maybe they'll help your grandchildren one day." He nodded thoughtfully. More neighboring farmers slowly adopted parts of Evelyn's careful methods. Not everyone changed overnight, but conversations began where none had existed before. People talked about healthy breeding instead of only faster production. They compared records instead of relying on memory alone. Helen often smiled quietly during these discussions. "Knowledge grows when people share it," she told Emily. Meanwhile, News about Walter Briggs spread through the county. The preserved letters hidden beneath the old coop had been reviewed by agricultural officials after Helen carefully documented their history and ownership. Although the letters did not accuse Walter personally of breaking any laws, they revealed years of pressure placed upon Evelyn Harper to abandon the breeding program she believed in so deeply. Farmers who once admired Briggs' agricultural enterprises now questioned the advice they had accepted without hesitation. Several longtime customers quietly chose not to renew contracts with his company. Others began asking difficult questions about breeding practices and flock health. Emily never celebrated Walter's declining reputation. When Noah mentioned the rumors one evening while repairing a fence, she simply shook her head. "I don't want anyone to lose everything." Noah leaned against the fence post and looked across the peaceful yard. Not even him. Emily watched the little hen guiding her growing flock through fresh grass. "I'd rather people learn than suffer." Noah smiled. "That's probably why this farm is changing people." Harper Farm slowly became known for something entirely different than disease or failure. Families visited on weekends to see the healthy heritage chickens. Children laughed as fluffy young birds followed Emily through the yard, hoping she carried grain in her pockets. Grace baked bread for visitors, while Noah proudly showed children the repaired barns and fences. Helen answered questions about poultry health beneath the shade of the old oak tree where Emily had once buried the first chickens that could not be saved. Emily never forgot those early losses. Whenever she passed beneath the oak, she paused for a quiet moment before continuing with her work. Remembering them reminded her how far the farm had come. One cool autumn afternoon, she visited Maple Grove Retirement Home again. Evelyn Harper sat beside the same sunny window, knitting another blanket. This time, Emily carried a basket filled with fresh eggs from the healthy flock. Evelyn gently picked one up, turning it slowly in her hands. Tears filled her eyes before she smiled.
They're beautiful.
Emily sat beside her. "The farm looks beautiful too." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment as though picturing every coop and pasture exactly as they once had been. Then it finally came home. They spent the afternoon talking about ordinary things instead of sadness. Evelyn shared stories about stubborn hens that escaped every fence she ever built. Emily laughed while describing the newest chicks chasing Noah's boots whenever he carried feed buckets. For the first time, the farm existed in Evelyn's memories without regret. Back at Harper Farm, the flock continued growing steadily. More healthy chicks hatched. The repaired coops slowly filled with life again. Fresh paint brightened old buildings that had once looked forgotten. Even the weathered sign at the entrance had been carefully restored, its faded letters visible once more to everyone passing along the road. One crisp morning, the mail carrier stopped beside the front gate instead of simply placing letters inside the mailbox. "This one's addressed to you personally," he said with a smile. Emily thanked him and examined the official envelope before opening it carefully. Inside rested a neatly folded invitation from the Millfield County Agricultural Fair. She unfolded the letter slowly while Grace and Noah waited beside her. The invitation explained that the organizers wished to recognize Harper Farm's remarkable recovery and invited Emily Carter to speak about the importance of responsible animal care and heritage breeding at the upcoming county fair. Emily looked up in surprise, reading the final lines once more to make certain she had understood them correctly. She had once arrived at Harper Farm with nothing but $20, an empty property, and a single dying hen. Now someone wanted to hear her story. Emily read the invitation several more times before carefully folding it and placing it inside Evelyn Harper's oldest journal. She still found it difficult to believe that anyone wanted to hear her speak. Only months earlier, people had laughed when she spent her last $20 on a farm everyone believed was beyond saving. Now the county agricultural fair wanted her to tell its story. "You should go," Grace said gently, as she poured tea into 3 cups that evening. Emily looked uncertain. "I'm not a speaker." Noah smiled from across the kitchen table. "You're just someone who tells the truth. That's enough." Helen nodded in agreement. "People don't need a perfect speech. They need an honest one." During the following week, Emily continued caring for the growing flock exactly as she always had. She refused to let the invitation distract her from the daily work that had brought Harper Farm back to life. Every morning she checked the water buckets, cleaned the nesting boxes, recorded observations in Evelyn's journals, and watched the little heritage hen guide her growing descendants across the yard. More healthy chicks had hatched since the first one, and the once empty coops now echoed with the gentle sounds of a thriving flock. The repaired buildings no longer looked forgotten. Fresh paint covered the weathered walls, new fencing surrounded the pastures, and flowers Grace planted beside the farmhouse porch bloomed brightly in the autumn sunshine. Visitors still arrived almost every weekend. Some came to learn about heritage breeding. Others simply wanted to see the farm they had heard so much about. Emily welcomed everyone kindly, always giving credit to Evelyn Harper's journals, Helen's guidance, Noah's friendship, and Grace's unwavering love. She never claimed the farm had been saved by one person alone. The evening before the county fair, Helen helped Emily organize a small display. They packed copies of Evelyn's breeding charts, photographs showing the farm before and after its restoration, and several pictures of the little hen with her first chick. Emily paused when she reached the very first photograph Noah had taken after she bought the property. Broken fences, empty coops, weeds everywhere. It hardly looked like the same place anymore. Grace gently touched the picture. "Never forget where hope began." Early the next morning, the 4 of them drove together to the Millfield County Agricultural Fair. The fairgrounds buzzed with families, livestock, and friendly conversations. Emily felt nervous as she stepped onto the grounds carrying the display box. She had never stood before a crowd before. The organizers welcomed her warmly and led her to a small stage beside the agricultural exhibits. Rows of folding chairs slowly filled with local farmers, families, children, and neighbors who had followed Harper Farm's remarkable recovery. Emily recognized many familiar faces, including the elderly farmer who had once warned her to leave the farm. He smiled encouragingly from the front row. When it was time to begin, Emily walked to the microphone with the little heritage hen resting calmly inside a comfortable wooden carrier beside the stage. The bird looked healthy and confident, her feathers shining in the morning light. Emily took a slow breath before speaking. "A few months ago," she began softly, "I had $20 left in the world." The audience became completely quiet. She told them about losing her parents, moving in with Grace, and seeing the auction notice for Harper Farm. She admitted that she knew almost nothing about running a farm. She described the laughter at the auction, the empty coops, and the heartbreaking days when nearly every remaining chicken died despite her efforts. She spoke about Helen teaching her patience, Noah helping repair buildings, Grace believing in her when she doubted herself, and the kindness of neighbors who slowly began leaving feed, straw, and supplies at the front gate. Then she carefully lifted Evelyn's journal for everyone to see. "The greatest gift I found wasn't hidden because it was valuable," she said. "It was hidden because someone hoped kindness would survive long enough to find it." She explained how Evelyn Harper had patiently bred healthier chickens for years instead of chasing quick profits, and how one tiny hen had carried that forgotten work into the future. She never mentioned Walter Briggs by name. She never blamed anyone. Instead, she spoke about responsibility, patience, and caring for every living creature with respect. Finally, she looked toward the little hen resting peacefully beside her. "People say this one chicken changed everything," Emily said with a smile. I think she reminded us of something we had forgotten. A child sitting near the front asked, quietly, "What was that?"
Emily smiled gently.
That every life matters, even when the world thinks it doesn't. The audience rose in applause. Many farmers remained afterward to ask questions, not about making more money, but about keeping healthier flocks, preserving careful breeding records, and passing knowledge to the next generation. Helen watched proudly as conversation spread from family to family beneath the exhibition tents. "Evelyn would have loved this," she whispered. A few days later, Emily invited Evelyn Harper to visit the farm. Grace and Noah helped prepare everything before her arrival. The restored entrance sign stood proudly beside the road. The barns had been repaired. The fences stretched neatly across green pastures. Healthy chickens wandered peacefully through clean yards filled with sunlight instead of silence. When Evelyn stepped carefully from Helen's car, she stopped walking almost immediately. Tears filled her eyes as she looked across the property she had once believed she would never see again. The little heritage hen wandered toward her first, followed closely by several generations of healthy descendants. Evelyn slowly knelt despite her aching knees and gently stroked the original survivor's feathers. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Emily shook her head softly. "You did. I only continued it." They spent the afternoon walking through every restored coop. Evelyn smiled at the careful records Emily had continued writing in fresh notebooks beside the originals. She laughed as curious young chickens gathered around Noah's boots exactly as Emily had described. Grace served lunch beneath the old oak tree, where sadness had slowly been replaced by gratitude. As the sun began to set, Evelyn stood quietly overlooking the fields. "For years," she said, "I thought losing this farm meant everything I had worked for was gone." She turned toward Emily with peaceful eyes. "I was wrong." Emily looked across the thriving flock filling the once empty coops. She thought about her parents, the promise she had made, the lonely days when every task felt impossible, and the tiny hen that had refused to give up. She finally understood that her parents had never expected her to save every animal. They had simply wanted her to keep showing compassion, even when success seemed impossible. Sometimes saving one life was enough to begin saving many more. As evening settled over Harper Farm, the little heritage hen gathered her growing family together beneath the warm light spilling from the restored coop. Around her wandered healthy sons, daughters, and grandchildren, filling the quiet farm with peaceful sounds of life. Emily stood beside Grace, Noah, Helen, and Evelyn, watching generation after generation follow the same small bird that everyone else had believed would never survive. In the end, it had never been luck that saved Harper Farm. It had been patience, kindness, and the courage to believe that even one small life could change everything.